As we do every week about this time, we'd like to bring in our panel for some political analysis. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief at USA Today. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Amy Walter is the national editor of the Cook Political Report and the host of the Takeaway podcast, conversation on WNYC, which is not to be confused with my own podcast here at CBS known as The Takeout. God, that was a long way around for not very much. Anyway, David Nakamura is also a reporter covering the White House for the Washington Post. Good morning, everyone. I don't need to say it's a tough morning, and I don't want to go through one of these banalities about, well, we're all so concerned. I just want to get a sense from you collectively. I'll start with you, Susan. Our nation's been through this process before, and every time we ask this question, is there a moment? Is this a moment? What do you think?
If 249 mass shootings in the space of a year is not enough to force political change, why would the 250th one be? Jeffrey reminded me that he and I sat at this table, on this panel, the morning after the Tree of Life shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and we had no particular answers then. And I don't know that we have any more answers now about why this would be the turning point that so many Americans say they want to see.
Jeffrey?
Well, you know, right after Sandy Hook, a number of people observed that what we learned is that the country will accept a certain level of child homicide in order to have the gun rights that we have in place and other issues. So things didn't change after that. So it's hard to imagine that things change after any particular event. This does feel a little bit different because it's the confluence of a gun issue and a racism issue, and both of those seem to be reaching a boiling point. But it's hard to say that this is a pivot. We might be pivoting toward an end to euphemism in some way. People seem to be tired of talking about thoughts and prayers. This idea of having a national conversation around every issue seems inadequate to the moment, but we'll see.
Amy, do you take anything of significance away from tweets this morning from Fred Upton, Republican, Michigan in the House, Lindsey Graham, Republican in South Carolina, talking about red flag laws, finding some place to reposition themselves within this conversation?
Well, I also think it goes beyond the legislative, and I think we all around the table know that too, that the issue really, when we're talking about the consequences of political rhetoric and where the incentives are, people like Will Hurd aren't coming back to Congress, in part, I know he didn't say this, but it can't be much fun to be somebody like Congressman Hurd. He is one of only 3 Republicans who sit in a district that Hillary Clinton carried. So now there will be, maybe, after 2020, only 2 left in districts that Hillary Clinton carried. Those are the folks that bring a diversity of ideas, who are there to sort of raise their hand and say, well, it might play in your district, but it doesn't play here, and to bring that kind of conversation. But that doesn't happen anymore. The people who are willing to compromise, those people have all been either defeated or they've left on their own. And so what that leaves us with is an incentive structure in Washington where it's all or none. I mean, this conversation in some ways isn't that hard to have, but we can't have it because there's no and or but into the conversation. It's either mental health issues or we have to get rid of all guns, right? There's somewhere in between here. And there's also the consequence of the rhetoric. And I think that's going to be, it's obviously been a big issue thus far under President Trump's tenure, but that there are actual consequences to stoking and inflaming. President Trump didn't invent this polarization, but the constant just stoking of it has actual consequences.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a president, I think in 2016, there was some general sense of if there was a president, given his conservative bona fides for President Trump, the way he campaigned, that he could somehow give cover to some Republicans on something like gun control, find, some common ground, as unlikely as that might be, this would be a possible president who could do something like that. He has shown no inclination to do so.
Right. The idea being Republicans will follow him just about anywhere, as will the base.
And I think what you're seeing, though, with this particular case, if this manifesto is indeed tied to the shooter in the case in El Paso, is that President Trump this is beyond an issue of mass shooting. It's now tied up into questions about white nationalism, about the president's rhetoric, and about Trumpism in an election year. So the idea that we could move forward and President Trump would be the one to give Lindsey Graham and others the political cover seems extremely unlikely.
I'm a little uncomfortable with the word manifesto. I think it invests a kind of credibility that this essay doesn't, I think, warrant. But be that as it may, and once authorities, and they're on this trail now, believe they can confirm that the two are linked, In it, it says, the increase in Hispanic population in Texas prompted his action, blames Democrat and Republican leaders and corporations for failing the country, specifies that neither President Trump nor any other presidential candidate inspired him, expresses support for the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand. Jeffrey, this is an impossible question to answer, but I'm going to give you a chance.
Oh, thank you.
Not what ought we conclude about it, but what does this tell us possibly that we should think about and maybe act on?
It tells us that another term that might be antiquated now is lone wolf. After you have so many lone wolves, it's a wolf pack. It's not connected in the same way as, say, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, structured organizations. But there is a common viewpoint shared by different white males in different parts of the world about the condition of the world. Social media has allowed this to grow mostly unnoticed. You don't need a terror organization anymore when people can connect their ideas to each other across social media, across the internet, and so we're in a completely different kind of challenge for law enforcement, where people are neither radicalized by organizational structures, but they're not self-radicalized either. There's so much help. And so, I mean, I agree with you on the manifest. It's a screed, and what it is a screed, it's a pastiche of ideas that have been floating around in the netherworld of the internet, and these young minds are putting these ideas together, and some are taking action.
And we had a warning of this last month. The FBI Director Chris Wray testified before Congress that the FBI had investigated nearly 100 instances this year of domestic terrorism, and most of them were associated in some way with white nationalism. And the only reason this testimony didn't get more attention, I think, is because it was right before Robert Mueller was testifying about the Russia investigation. But that is a pretty sobering message. Nearly as many examples of domestic terrorism being pursued by the FBI as international terrorism inside our borders.
George P. Bush is the land commissioner of Texas, the grandson of George Herbert Walker Bush, the son of Jeb Bush. Very quick on Twitter to describe his career in Afghanistan as a naval officer. Quoting him directly on Twitter, there have now been multiple attacks from self-declared white terrorists here in the U.S. in the last several months. This is a real and present threat that we must all denounce and defeat. Amy, do you think that is singularly suggestive of the Bush family writ large? And do you think it will be something that Republicans, like Will Hurd and others, will rally around?
So George P. Bush is in Texas, a state that is obviously incredibly diverse. If he wants to run for higher office in the state of Texas, he understands and appreciates what that would look like, the coalition that you need to put together to win in a state like Texas, and the age that he is right now is much younger, knowing where we're headed in the future. So I think he reflects where the party needs to go. But right now, in the age of Trump, they are in a place where that's not true. I just wanted to give one statistic. Right now in Congress, Republicans represent 83% of the 100 districts with the highest share of native-born residents. So places that have the highest share of non-native-born residents are held by Democrats.
David, it sounds like George P. Bush is thinking about the future and is suggesting with this tweet, it seems to me, and to pick up on Amy's point, that though this may be the current trajectory, he does not believe it is the long-term trajectory.
Sure. I mean, there's Democrats that go even back to Obama days that talked about, trying to embed in Texas to help it turn blue. I think, though, more immediately, of course, I was reminded just that President Trump himself visited El Paso at the same time. He gave a speech there. And if you look, I went and looked back at his speech. It talked about his immigration agenda, did not mention almost anything about the positive aspects of immigration, certainly, and also, recited a number of statistics that were inflated and inaccurate about the dangers of immigrants and undocumented immigrants. He called Juarez, Mexico, right across the border, one of the most dangerous cities in the world. He inflated the number of murders and violent crimes among immigrants. This is a president, if you think about it, too, beyond just talking about a caravan invasion, he talked about an emergency at the border that he had to act. And if you look at sort of the language of this, the screed, whatever you want to call it, that was posted online by potentially by the alleged shooter, it echoes quite a bit of that.
Jeffrey.
Just one note on George P. Bush. Let's credit him with electoral acumen, but let's also credit George P. Bush and other people in the Bush family and other Republicans with being genuinely horrified by the ethno-nationalist tilt of the Republican Party and especially its president. I mean, I think that there are large numbers of people, many of whom have left Congress recently, who don't like the way this is going and don't like the association of the Republican Party with a kind of white nationalism.
Susan?
We know over the
about 40
long term.
seconds.
We know over the long term this is a losing proposition for the Republican Party to give up on black members, to give up on Hispanic voters. But what we don't know is whether it works in the short term in next year's election.
Susan Page, thank you very much. We'll be right back.